The narrative of one of the most scrutinized disappearances in modern history begins not with chaos, but with the mundane rhythm of a holiday evening. It was May 3rd, 2007, in the coastal town of Praia da Luz, Portugal. The location was the Ocean Club, a resort that was popular among families for its perceived safety and contained environment. To understand the gravity of the incident that was about to unfold, one must first analyze the geography and the decisions made by the group of friends, later known in the media as the Tapas 7. The layout of the resort is a critical piece of evidence in itself. The apartment where the family was staying was situated on the ground floor, a position that security experts have since debated at length. It offered easy access to the pool and the restaurant. But critically, it also offered easy access to the public street. The restaurant, where the parents and their friends chose to dine that evening, was located approximately 100 yards away from the sleeping quarters. In the context of a relaxed holiday, 100 yards feels insignificant, a mere stone's throw. However, in the context of security and risk assessment, that distance created a physical and auditory disconnect between the protectors and the protected. The group had established a routine that they believed was responsible. Rather than using a professional sitting service, they devised a checking system. This involved one of the adults leaving the dinner table at regular intervals, roughly every 20 to 30 minutes, to walk back to the apartments and ensure that the young family members were resting peacefully. From a sociological perspective, this decision has been the subject of intense global debate. It reflects a cultural comfort zone, a belief that a resort environment acts as a sanctuary where the dangers of the outside world are suspended. Your support ensures that the search for the truth never fades into silence. Please like and subscribe to help us amplify this investigation. Stay with us, because the timeline you are about to witness contains anomalies that defy all explanation. Critics argue that this was a lapse in judgment that created a window of opportunity, while supporters argue it was a standard practice for families vacationing in a close-knit environment. The atmosphere at the table was described as convivial. The group was enjoying the final days of their vacation. At approximately 9 in the evening, the father made his check. He reported that everything was calm. The doors were closed, and the silence in the apartment indicated that the young family members were sound asleep. This timestamp is crucial for investigators because it establishes the last confirmed moment of safety. If the father's observation was accurate, the timeline for the subsequent disappearance is narrowed down to a terrifyingly short window of time. However, the tranquility was deceptive. During this interval, a fellow holidaymaker reported seeing a man walking away from the direction of the apartment complex. This individual was described as carrying something or someone in his arms. At the time, this sighting seemed innocuous, perhaps just another parent carrying a sleeping family member. In hindsight, this moment has been dissected by thousands of investigators and armchair detectives. Was this the perpetrator making an escape under the cover of a casual demeanor? The failure to identify this stranger immediately is often cited as the first missed opportunity in the investigation, a phantom figure that would haunt the case for decades. At 10 in the evening, it was the mother's turn to conduct the check. The transition from a relaxing dinner to a life-altering tragedy occurred in the span of a few minutes. Upon entering the apartment, she noticed that the door to the room where the young family members were resting was open, despite the parents being certain it had been left closed. The draft in the room was palpable. The window was open, and the shutter was raised. The bed where the daughter had been resting was empty. The initial reaction was not one of immediate forensic deduction, but of human confusion. The mother assumed the daughter had wandered off, perhaps looking for her parents. She searched the immediate vicinity of the apartment. It was only when the silence remained unbroken and the daughter could not be found that the realization struck. The checking system, designed to provide peace of mind, had failed. The sanctuary had been breached. The mother returned to the restaurant, not with a report of silence, but with an alarm that would shatter the peace of Praia da Luz forever. The phrase she reportedly uttered indicated that the daughter was gone, taken. This marked the end of the evening and the beginning of the incident, shifting the narrative from a holiday diary to a criminal case file. The immediate aftermath of the discovery is what investigators refer to as the golden hour. In missing person cases, this term refers to the first hour following the disappearance, a critical period where evidence is fresh, witnesses are present, and the likelihood of recovery is highest. In this case, reports suggest that the golden hour was consumed by panic and a lack of protocol, a factor that would severely hamper the investigation for years to come. Once the alarm was raised at the restaurant, the dinner party dissolved into a frantic search party. Staff from the Ocean Club and other guests joined the effort. While the intention was noble, a community rallying to find a lost individual, the execution had unintended consequences. Dozens of people began combing through the area, calling out the name of the missing daughter. More critically, people entered and exited the apartment, the secure location that was now, in reality, a crime scene. From a forensic standpoint, this period was catastrophic. Every footprint added to the carpet, every surface touched by a well-meaning friend or staff member potentially degraded vital biological traces left by a perpetrator. The timeline indicates that the local police, the Guardia Nacional Republicana, were contacted shortly after the search began. However, there was a delay in their arrival, and upon reaching the scene, there was an initial assumption that governed their actions: the theory of a wander-off. This assumption is common in resort disappearances. Authorities often default to the most likely scenario: a young person waking up, feeling disoriented, and walking outside. Consequently, the initial search focused on the pool areas, the roads, and the beach, operating under the belief that the individual was lost but local. This mindset delayed the sealing off of the apartment and the implementation of a lockdown of the town. By the time the theory shifted from a lost person to a taking or a forced disappearance, valuable time had elapsed. The border police and airport staff were eventually put on alert, but questions remain about the speed of this dissemination. Portugal shares an open border with Spain, and the drive from Praia da Luz to the border is relatively short. Analysts have pointed out that a perpetrator with a vehicle could have easily crossed into another jurisdiction while the local search was still focused on the resort grounds. This logistical reality highlights the challenges of cross-border policing in the European Union, a theme that would recur throughout the investigation. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted from frantic activity to a heavy, ominous dread. The wander-off theory began to lose credibility as hours passed without a sighting. The weather was cool, and a young individual dressed in light sleepwear would not likely remain hidden or silent for so long if they were merely lost nearby. The realization that a third party was involved began to take hold. The media landscape began to shift as well. In 2007, the news cycle was already 24 hours, but social media was in its infancy. However, the demographic of the missing individual's family doctors from the United Kingdom and the location ensured that the story would travel fast. By the following morning, British consular staff were involved, and the machinery of international press coverage was beginning to turn. One must also consider the psychological impact on the witnesses during this initial chaos. The statements given to the police in those early hours were fragmented, colored by shock and fear. The descriptions of the stranger seen earlier in the evening were not immediately correlated with the disappearance. It was a puzzle with pieces being scattered rather than assembled. The friction between the British group and the Portuguese authorities also began to simmer. Language barriers and procedural differences created an undercurrent of frustration. The British expectation of an immediate, high-tech forensic sweep clashed with the local constabulary's initial low-key approach. By daybreak, the resort looked different. It was no longer a holiday destination, but the epicenter of a mystery. The apartment was finally cordoned off, but the damage to the forensic integrity of the scene had likely already been done. The incident had occurred, the perpetrator had vanished into the night, and the complex web of leads, suspects, and theories that would captivate the world for nearly 2 decades had begun to spin. The search had officially moved from a rescue mission to a criminal investigation, one that would expose the vulnerabilities of even the most seemingly secure environments. In the annals of criminal investigation, there exists a concept known as the golden hour. This term refers to the brief, critical window of time immediately following a report of a serious incident, typically the first 24 to 48 hours, when the potential for recovering evidence and securing a positive outcome is at its peak. In the case of the disappearance at Praia da Luz, analysts and forensic experts almost unanimously agree that this golden hour was not just lost. It was obliterated by a series of procedural missteps and a fundamental misunderstanding of the crime scene's nature. The primary failure, according to retrospective critiques of the investigation, was the inability to secure the apartment. From the moment the alarm was raised, the residence ceased to be a holiday rental and became a site of critical importance. However, reports indicate that in the chaos of the search, the apartment was left accessible to a multitude of people. Friends, resort staff, and even local police officers were reported to have entered and exited the premises without protective clothing or strict logging procedures. This traffic had a devastating effect on the forensic integrity of the location. From a scientific perspective, every individual who entered that space introduced new biological material, hair, fibers, skin cells, and potentially destroyed existing traces left by a perpetrator. The biological breakdown evidence, which could have provided a definitive genetic link to a stranger, was compromised. Critics argue that this contamination made it nearly impossible to distinguish between the background noise of innocent holidaymakers and the specific signature of a criminal intruder. The timeline suggests that the scene was not professionally sealed until the following morning, a delay that many seasoned investigators view as catastrophic. Simultaneously, a significant disconnect occurred regarding the scope of the alert. While the local search was frantic, the locking down of the wider perimeter was sluggish. The geographical reality of the Algarve region is that it provides relatively easy access to the Spanish border. A vehicle traveling at normal speeds could exit the country within a few hours. However, the implementation of rigorous border checks and the alerting of airport staff did not happen with the immediacy required for a taking scenario. This delay allowed for a window of opportunity where a vehicle could have transported the missing individual hundreds of miles away before a coordinated dragnet was fully established. During this period of confusion, the first significant lead regarding a suspect emerged, although its importance would not be fully realized until later. A member of the dining group reported seeing a man carrying a young family member away from the apartment complex earlier that evening. This sighting, which occurred before the alarm was raised, was initially dismissed as irrelevant. The witness described a man walking with purpose, carrying a sleeping individual in a way that seemed possibly tender yet hurried. This description became the cornerstone of the stranger theory. The analysis of this sighting reveals the fragility of eyewitness testimony. The man was not immediately stopped or questioned because, in the context of a family resort, a man carrying a young person is a common sight. It was only when the narrative shifted from a peaceful evening to a tragedy that this memory took on a sinister weight. Media commentators have since pointed out that this moment represents the duality of the resort environment, a place where normal behaviors mask potential criminal acts because the observers are psychologically conditioned to see safety rather than danger. As the first 24 hours turned into 48, the mood shifted from frantic hope to a heavy realization of the situation's gravity. The parents, now thrust into the center of a global media storm, began to express a deep, visceral despair. However, in their public appearances, they had to navigate the complex advice of law enforcement and public relations experts. They were advised to remain focused, to appeal to the takers rather than succumbing to visible collapse. This controlled emotion was later scrutinized by the public, with some interpreting their composure as suspicious. A classic example of how subjective human behavior is often misread in high-pressure incidents. The investigation also faced a cultural and procedural clash. British policing methods, which rely heavily on immediate technological support and aggressive media appeals, conflicted with the Portuguese judicial secrecy laws and procedural pacing. This friction created a vacuum of information that the media was all too eager to fill. Instead of a unified front, the public witnessed a disjointed narrative where leaks and rumors began to compete with official facts. Furthermore, the initial hypothesis held by the local authorities that the young individual had wandered off and met with an accident meant that valuable resources were directed towards searching drains, pools, and coastlines, rather than treating the case as a criminal extraction from the outset. This tunnel vision is a common pitfall in missing person cases involving young subjects. By the time the hypothesis shifted to a criminal act, the trail had gone cold. The secure location had been breached. The border had remained porous for too long, and the golden hour had expired, leaving behind a mystery that would only deepen with time. The tragedy of this phase lies not just in the disappearance itself, but in the knowledge that the system designed to protect and recover the vulnerable failed to activate its most crucial protocols when they mattered most. The loss of the golden hour remains the single most cited reason why, nearly 2 decades later, the question of what happened that night remains unanswered. The investigation was forced to play catch-up from day 2, chasing shadows that had already slipped away into the dark. As the initial shock of the first 48 hours began to subside, the investigation entered a new, more expansive phase. The chaotic energy of the early search efforts, largely driven by panic and adrenaline, transitioned into a more sustained, albeit controversial, operation. This period, spanning from late May through July of 2007, is often cited by criminologists as the moment when the case grew from a local incident into an international phenomenon. It was characterized by a massive mobilization of human resources, a shifting narrative regarding the fate of the missing daughter, and the introduction of specialized forensic tools that would eventually alter the course of the inquiry. In the days immediately following the disappearance, the resort town witnessed an unprecedented influx of volunteers. Hundreds of individuals, ranging from fellow holidaymakers to local residents and expatriates, joined the search parties. From a sociological perspective, this response highlights the visceral, universal horror that such a taking evokes. Strangers coordinated with local authorities to comb through the surrounding areas, including the scrubland, the beaches, and the rugged coastline. However, analysts have since pointed out the double-edged nature of this volunteerism. While the sheer number of people meant that a vast amount of ground was covered, the lack of professional coordination meant that potential evidence in the wider perimeter may have been inadvertently trampled or displaced. The search was described by observers as desperate rather than surgical, a race against time that prioritized visual confirmation over forensic preservation. By June, a significant psychological shift occurred within the investigation. Portuguese authorities publicly stated their working theory. They believed the missing individual was still alive and likely being held within the country. This hypothesis, while offering a fragile lifeline of hope to the family, was met with skepticism by international criminal profilers. Statistically, in cases of stranger takings, the window for recovery without loss of life narrows dramatically with each passing day. The insistence on a local and alive scenario influenced the allocation of resources, keeping the focus tight within the borders rather than treating it immediately as a cross-border transport case. Critics argue that this optimism, while perhaps intended to manage public panic, may have delayed the activation of wider European law enforcement protocols. It was during this month that the first admissions regarding the compromised crime scene began to surface. A senior official acknowledged that vital clues might have been lost due to the lack of immediate protection of the apartment. This admission was a pivotal moment for media commentators, who began to frame the narrative not just as a tragedy, but as a procedural failure. The discussion shifted from who took her to why was the investigation flawed. This change in tone marked the beginning of the intense scrutiny that would be directed at the local police force, creating a defensive atmosphere that would complicate future cooperation with international agencies. In July, the dynamic of the investigation changed once again with the arrival of specialized support from the United Kingdom. 2 highly trained canine units were brought in to assist. These were not ordinary search dogs. They were trained to detect specific biological markers, one for the scent of human life, and another for the scent of biological breakdown or human expiration. The introduction of these animals marked a transition from a traditional search for a physical person to a forensic search for invisible evidence. The deployment of these canine units was a controversial maneuver. Their alerts are intelligence tools, not direct evidence, yet their reactions in the apartment and, crucially, around the rental vehicle hired by the family weeks after the incident sent shockwaves through the investigation. When the dogs signaled the presence of potential biological traces, it forced the detectives to consider a darker, more complex possibility. The narrative began to pivot away from a straightforward stranger, taking toward theories that involved those closer to the center of the case. This phase of the investigation also highlighted the stark contrast between policing cultures. The British approach relied heavily on these technological and biological indicators, pushing for a forensic deconstruction of the scene even weeks later. In contrast, the local methodology had been more reliant on witness statements and traditional interrogation. This clash of philosophies created friction, with leaks to the press becoming a common occurrence. The public was presented with 2 competing realities, one where a predator was still at large, and another where the answer lay hidden within the complex forensic puzzle of the apartment itself. Ultimately, this period of intensification did not yield the breakthrough the world was waiting for. Instead, it deepened the mystery. The searches of the scrubland produced no physical items of significance. The canine alerts, while dramatic, could not be immediately corroborated by physical samples that withstood initial laboratory testing. The investigation found itself trapped between the absence of evidence, no body, no weapon, no confession, and the evidence of absence, where the lack of a clear trail seemed to defy the logic of modern surveillance and policing. The summer of 2007 ended not with answers, but with a hardening of positions, setting the stage for the legal and emotional battles that were to follow. By August of 2007, the investigation had reached a grim psychological milestone, the 100th day since the disappearance. In the world of criminal investigation, the passage of time is the enemy of truth. As the summer months waned, so too did the initial optimism that characterized the early search efforts. The narrative began to undergo a fundamental transformation, shifting from a frantic rescue operation to a somber, long-term inquiry. It was during this period that investigating officers publicly acknowledged, for the first time, the possibility that the missing daughter might not be found alive. This admission was a devastating blow to the momentum of the public campaign, signaling to the world that the authorities were now pivoting toward a recovery scenario rather than a rescue. The atmosphere in Praia da Luz had changed perceptibly. The volunteers had largely dispersed, and the media presence, though still significant, had turned more analytical and, at times, hostile. The incident was no longer just a story of a missing individual. It was becoming a story of suspicion. The forensic focus had narrowed, moving away from the theory of a stranger vanishing into the night and turning inward, toward the family and their immediate circle. This shift is often cited by legal analysts as a classic example of tunnel vision in high-pressure cases, where the absence of external leads forces investigators to scrutinize the victims themselves. On September 6th, the situation escalated dramatically. The mother was summoned to the police headquarters for questioning. Unlike previous interviews, which were treated as witness statements intended to help the investigation, this session was adversarial. The interrogation lasted for hours, marking a distinct change in the relationship between the family and the Portuguese authorities. The following day, September 7th, detectives took the extraordinary step of declaring both parents arguidos. To understand the weight of this development, One must understand the Portuguese legal term arguido. It translates roughly to formal suspect or person of interest. It is a status that grants certain legal protections, such as the right to remain silent. But in the court of public opinion, it is often misinterpreted as a prelude to a charge. The declaration sent shockwaves through the global media. The narrative flipped overnight. The parents, who had been portrayed as victims of a terrible tragedy, were now being viewed through a lens of doubt. The police theory suggested that the parents might be involved in concealing a tragic accident or a fatal incident. The basis for this suspicion relied heavily on the interpretation of biological traces found in the apartment and the rental vehicle. However, critics and forensic experts have since argued that the science used to justify the arguido status was inconclusive. The DNA evidence was complex and mixed, capable of being interpreted in multiple ways. Yet, the stigma of the suspect status stuck. The parents vehemently denied any involvement, maintaining that their daughter had been taken by a stranger. This period created a deep schism in the public consciousness. Those who believed in the stranger theory and those who suspected parental involvement. Days after being named suspects, the family made the decision to return to the United Kingdom. This departure was another polarizing moment. To their supporters, it was a necessary retreat for the well-being of the remaining young family members and a way to regroup legally. To their detractors, it was framed as a flight from justice. The image of the family boarding the plane marked the physical end of their time in Portugal, but it was only the beginning of a legal and reputational battle that would span decades. From a journalistic perspective, the arguido phase represents the lowest point in the relationship between the investigators and the family. It highlighted the immense pressure on the local police to solve a case that was damaging the region's reputation as a safe tourist destination. By pointing the finger at the parents, the narrative of a predator roaming the Algarve was temporarily silenced, replaced by a domestic tragedy theory. However, this theory would ultimately fail to hold up in court. Later, prosecutors would admit that there was no new evidence to justify re-questioning the couple or maintaining their suspect status indefinitely. The lack of a body, a weapon, or a confession meant that the case against them was circumstantial at best. Yet, the damage was done. The shift in perspective had occurred, and the simple, heartbreaking story of a missing daughter had been irrevocably complicated by allegations, rumors, and a forensic puzzle that refused to be solved. The investigation had moved from the scrubland to the laboratory, and finally to the court of public opinion, where the verdict remains divided to this day. By late 2007, the narrative trajectory of the investigation began to pivot once again. Following the tumultuous events of September, where the parents were designated as formal suspects, the focus in November shifted back toward the possibility of external involvement. In November, the father released a video statement that introduced a chilling new perspective to the case. He articulated a belief that the family had been watched by a criminal or an offender in the days leading up to the disappearance. This statement was significant because it moved the conversation away from the idea of an opportunistic crime, a random act of seizing a moment, to a theory of premeditation. The concept that the family was under surveillance implies a level of calculation and intent that transforms the incident from a tragic misfortune into a targeted operation. Security analysts have noted that this theory aligns with the layout of the resort, where the movements of guests could be easily observed from public pathways without drawing immediate attention. This surveillance theory served a dual purpose. Forensically, it urged investigators to look for individuals who had no legitimate reason to be near the apartment block in the preceding days. Publicly, it served to counter the arguido narrative, reminding the world that while the parents were being scrutinized, a potential offender remained at large. It highlighted the vulnerability of the secure location, suggesting that the night schedule of checking on the young family members had been noted and exploited by a third party. The momentum of this external theory accelerated in January 2008. The parents released sketches of a suspect, a development that is often a double-edged sword in criminal investigations. These sketches were based on the testimony of a British holidaymaker who had been staying at the resort during the same period. This witness described a man with an unsettling demeanor or a creepy presence who had been seen near the complex. The release of these sketches generated a massive influx of calls and potential sightings. From a journalistic standpoint, this phenomenon is known as availability bias. When the public is presented with a visual representation of a threat, they begin to see that face in crowds, in airports, and in their local neighborhoods. While this keeps the case in the public eye, it also creates a logistical nightmare for police, who must sift through thousands of false positives to find a single credible lead. Critics of the investigation have pointed out the delay in releasing these images. The sighting occurred in May 2007, yet the sketches were not made public until January 2008. A gap of nearly 8 months. In the context of memory retention, this delay is critical. Psychologists argue that eyewitness memory is malleable and degrades quickly. By the time the sketches were released, the stranger could have altered his appearance significantly, or the witness's memory could have been influenced by the months of intense media coverage that followed the incident. The description provided depicted a man who did not fit the typical profile of a tourist. He was described as looking out of place, loitering, rather than vacationing. This reinforces the surveillance narrative, suggesting that the perpetrator was not a transient opportunist, but someone who was geographically anchored to the area or specifically targeting the resort. However, without a name or a digital footprint, a sketch remains a ghost, a representation of a fear rather than a confirmed identity. In April 2008, the procedural complexity of the case deepened. Portuguese police officers flew to the United Kingdom to attend interviews conducted by the local British police force. The subjects of these interviews were the friends who had dined with the family on the night of the disappearance, the group colloquially known in the media as the Tapas 7. This cross-border cooperation was fraught with legal and diplomatic tension. The Portuguese authorities were operating under their judicial system, which allows for different questioning techniques and assumes different rights for witnesses compared to the British system. The presence of foreign detectives in a British interview room was highly unusual and underscored the lack of trust that had developed between the two jurisdictions. The purpose of these re-interviews was to drill down into the inconsistencies in the timeline. The checking system used by the group was scrutinized to the minute. Every exit from the table, every observation of the apartment door, and every interaction with staff was re-examined. The investigators were looking for the cracks in the story, the moments where the testimony of one friend might contradict another. For the friends involved, this was an ordeal of memory and loyalty. They were being asked to recall specific details from a night that had occurred nearly a year prior, a night that had ended in trauma. Legal experts have commented that such interviews often produce contamination errors, where the witnesses inadvertently share details or align their stories over time, making it difficult to extract the raw, unpolished truth. The outcome of these April interviews did not yield a smoking gun or a confession. Instead, it solidified the stalemate. The friends maintained their account of the evening: a routine dinner, a regular checking system, and a tragic discovery. The Portuguese police returned to their headquarters without the breakthrough they sought to justify the arguido status of the parents. By the end of this phase, the investigation was suspended in a state of ambiguity. The shadows, represented by the sketches, and the surveillance theory pointed to a stranger who had vanished. The interviews pointed back to the circle of friends and family, probing for a deception that could not be proven. The public was left with two competing narratives: a sophisticated taking by a calculated offender, or a domestic incident covered up by a group of professionals. The inability of the investigation to decisively rule out either scenario allowed the mystery to fester, creating a void that would eventually be filled by private investigators and cold case reviews. By May 3, 2008, the world marked exactly 1 year since the disappearance at the Ocean Club. Anniversaries in criminal investigations are psychologically complex milestones. They serve as a focal point for media attention, reigniting public interest. But they also underscore the lack of progress. On this date, the mother of the missing daughter made a poignant public appeal, urging the global community to continue to hope and pray for the return of the young family member. From a sociological perspective, this moment highlighted the enduring nature of ambiguous loss, a psychological state where family members are denied the closure of a confirmed outcome, forcing them to exist in a perpetual state of waiting. However, behind the scenes, the momentum of the official investigation was grinding to a halt. The frantic energy of the initial search and the intense scrutiny of the arguido phase had yielded no prosecutable evidence. The files, now thousands of pages thick, contained witness statements, forensic reports, and timelines. Yet they lacked the singular piece of evidence required to build a case against any individual. In July 2008, 14 months after the incident began, the Portuguese authorities made a decisive and controversial announcement. The Attorney General's office declared that the investigation was to be shelved. In legal terms, this meant the case was being archived, pending the emergence of new, credible evidence. This decision effectively paused the active police hunt, signaling that the resources of the state were being withdrawn from the daily pursuit of answers. Simultaneously, and perhaps most significantly for the family, the authorities officially lifted the arguido status of the parents. This legal maneuver formally removed the designation of suspect that had been placed on them in September of the previous year. For the family, this was a necessary vindication, a legal acknowledgement that the theory of their involvement, which had dominated tabloid headlines, lacked sufficient evidentiary basis to proceed to court. However, legal analysts have noted that the lifting of the status was not a declaration of innocence in the absolute sense, but rather a declaration of insufficient evidence. This nuance allowed the cloud of suspicion to linger in the court of public opinion, fueled by internet forums and unauthorized books. Despite the lack of official charges, the closure of the official file created a dangerous vacuum. With the police stepping back, the family was forced to take the investigation into their own hands. This marked the beginning of the private investigation phase. The family hired private detective agencies to continue the search. This shift from public law enforcement to private enterprise introduced a new set of challenges and risks. Private investigators, unlike sworn police officers, lack statutory powers. They cannot execute search warrants. They cannot subpoena bank records or telephone data, and they cannot arrest suspects. Their role is limited to surveillance, interviewing willing witnesses, and analyzing existing data. Critics of this phase argue that it exposed the family to charlatans and opportunists. The desperation for answers makes families in this position vulnerable to individuals selling false leads or claiming to have inside knowledge. The narrative of the investigation became fragmented, with various private teams pursuing leads that the police had either dismissed or missed, often leading to dead ends in countries as far away as Morocco and Spain. From a journalistic viewpoint, the shelving of the case in 2008 represents a failure of international cooperation. The Portuguese police were exhausted and defensive, feeling besieged by the British media. The British authorities were frustrated by their lack of jurisdiction. The result was a stalemate, where the missing individual became a file number in an archive, rather than the subject of an active manhunt. The decision to close the case also highlighted the limitations of forensic science at the time. The controversial DNA alerts from the previous year had failed to provide a definitive match that could withstand a court's scrutiny. The biological breakdown evidence, which had once promised to solve the riddle, had instead added to the confusion. Without a body and without a confession, the legal system reached its limit. By the end of 2008, the incident had transformed. It was no longer a breaking news story, but a cold case. The secure location where the event took place had been renovated and re-rented. The witnesses had returned to their lives. The suspect's sketches had faded from the front pages. Yet, the central mystery remained. How could a young individual vanish from a room, leaving no physical trace and no witnesses, in a window of time that lasted only minutes? The archiving of the case did not end the story. It merely moved it from the police station to the private sector, ensuring that the search for the truth would continue, albeit in the shadows, for many years to come. By 2011, 4 years had elapsed since the incident at Praia da Luz. In the realm of missing persons cases, this duration usually signals a transition from active investigation to cold case status. However, the disappearance of the young family member remained a unique anomaly in the media landscape. The private investigations, funded by the family, had kept the search alive, but they lacked the statutory authority of a government-backed police force. It was in this context that a significant political intervention occurred, reshaping the entire structure of the inquiry. In May of 2011, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, responded to a direct appeal from the parents. He requested that the Metropolitan Police, specifically Scotland Yard, assist in the investigation. This directive marked the birth of Operation Grange. From a procedural standpoint, this was highly unusual. British police typically do not investigate crimes committed in foreign jurisdictions, nor do they usually intervene at the behest of political figures. Analysts have noted that this decision underscored the exceptional nature of the case, highlighting how public pressure can influence law enforcement priorities. The initial phase of Operation Grange was not a new search in the physical sense, but rather a review. A team of detectives, led by Detective Chief Inspector Andy Redwood, began the monumental task of collating information. The investigation was fragmented across 3 distinct databases: the original Portuguese files, the files from the British police who assisted in the early days, and the data gathered by the private investigators hired by the family. The objective was to digitize and cross-reference every scrap of information to identify leads that had been missed due to the siloed nature of the previous inquiries. In April 2012, after a year of silent analysis, the operation made its first significant public move. Detective Redwood appeared on a major broadcast to announce that his team was seeking to bring closure to the case. He revealed that the review had identified gaps in the timeline windows of opportunity that had not been fully explored. This statement was crucial because it signaled to the public that the British authorities believed there was still a solvable mystery rather than a hopeless dead end. To reinvigorate public interest, the detectives released a computer-generated image of what the missing daughter might look like years later. The release of time progression images is a psychologically potent tool. It forces the public to confront the passage of time. The image replaced the frozen memory of the individual at the time of the vanishing with a projection of a growing person. Experts in victimology argue that while these images are necessary for identification, they also serve a secondary purpose. They humanize the long-term missing status, reminding witnesses that the individual they should be looking for is no longer the small subject seen in the posters from 2007. However, diplomatic tensions remained. While the British team was ramping up, the Portuguese authorities initially stated in 2012 that they were not reopening their investigation. This refusal created a complex legal dynamic. Operation Grange had the funding and the manpower, but they had no jurisdiction on Portuguese soil. They could not arrest, search, or interview without the explicit permission and presence of their Portuguese counterparts. This period is often cited by legal scholars as a case study in the difficulties of international policing within the European Union. The turning point came in 2013. By July, Scotland Yard announced that the review phase had evolved into a formal investigation. They stated they had identified new evidence and new witnesses. This shift from review to investigation allowed the British police to send formal international letters of request to Portugal, compelling a more direct cooperation. The pressure mounted, and in October, the Portuguese police officially reopened their investigation to run alongside the British inquiry. The scale of the new inquiry was revealed when Scotland Yard announced they had identified 41 potential suspects. This number was staggering to outside observers. It suggested that the stranger theory was not limited to a single phantom, but involved a web of individuals who had been in or around the resort. The detectives focused heavily on the creepy man sightings and the records of mobile phones that had pinged off the local towers during the critical window of the disappearance. The most significant public appeal of this era occurred via the television program Crime Watch in October 2013. The detectives presented a revised timeline that effectively ruled out the previous Tanner sighting, a man seen carrying a young individual earlier in the evening, and placed heavy emphasis on the Smith sighting, a man seen carrying a blonde young individual toward the beach much later. That night, new electronic facial identification images, or EFITs, were broadcast. This broadcast generated thousands of calls and emails. It demonstrated that even 6 years later, the public remained deeply engaged. However, critics of Operation Grange have pointed out the immense cost running into the millions of pounds and questioned whether the results justified the expenditure. They argue that while the investigation was thorough, it was hampered by the delay. The new witnesses were often recalling events from half a decade prior, and the new evidence was largely circumstantial. Nevertheless, Operation Grange succeeded in one critical aspect. It cleared the parents of suspicion in the eyes of the British authorities. By focusing aggressively on the stranger and burglary gone wrong theories, the investigation shifted the narrative definitively away from the domestic speculation that had plagued the family. It re-established the search for a third-party offender as the primary objective, setting the stage for the eventual identification of a new prime suspect years later. The operation proved that while forensic traces may fade, the data trail, phone records, travel documents, and witness statements remains waiting to be decoded. By late 2013, the investigation had entered a phase of unprecedented scale. Following the formal reopening of the inquiry by Scotland Yard, detectives announced a staggering development. They had identified 41 potential suspects. This revelation shifted the public perception of the case entirely. For years, the narrative had oscillated between a single opportunistic stranger and domestic theories. The emergence of such a large list of persons of interest suggested that the environment around the resort was far more complex and potentially dangerous than previously understood. From an investigative standpoint, managing a list of 41 suspects is a logistical nightmare. Analysts pointed out that this number included individuals who were not necessarily primary perpetrators, but people who had come to the attention of authorities for various reasons, past criminal histories, inconsistent statements, or circumstantial proximity to the scene. The strategy employed by the British detectives was one of elimination. They sought to systematically rule out individuals to narrow the field, a process that required international cooperation and immense data processing. In October 2013, the investigation made a high-profile move to engage the public directly. A major television appeal was broadcast, featuring new electronic facial identification images, known as EFITs. These images depicted a man seen carrying a fair-haired young individual in Praia da Luz on the night of the disappearance. This appeal was significant because it marked a strategic pivot in the timeline. The detectives publicly discounted an earlier sighting which had been central to the case for 6 years and placed their weight behind a different witness account. This shift in focus was analyzed heavily by criminologists. By changing the primary suspect description and the time of the sighting, the police were essentially rewriting the established narrative of the night. It forced the public to discard their mental image of the event and accept a new version of the truth. Critics argued that changing the timeline so late in the investigation risked confusing potential witnesses, while supporters argued it was a necessary correction of early errors. The appeal generated a massive response, with hundreds of calls and emails flooding the incident room, demonstrating that the case still held a grip on the global conscience. The momentum from this appeal carried into the summer of 2014. In June, the investigation manifested physically in the town of Praia da Luz. British detectives, accompanied by their Portuguese counterparts, launched a major search operation in an area of scrubland situated southwest of the Ocean Club complex. This was the most visible police activity the town had seen since the initial days of the incident. The choice of this location was not random. It was based on the new lines of inquiry and the analysis of the movements of the identified persons of interest. The operation was comprehensive. Police utilized ground-penetrating radar, specialist sniffer dogs, and heavy excavation equipment. The imagery of officers in high-visibility vests sifting through the earth became a defining visual of this era. From a journalistic perspective, this search was a statement of intent. It demonstrated that the authorities were willing to literally turn the earth to find an answer. However, the psychological toll of such searches is profound. For the family, it represents a moment of suspended animation, a terrifying hope that something might be found, coupled with the dread of what that discovery might be. For the local community, it was a reopening of old wounds, dragging the town back into the shadow of the tragedy. Despite the intensity of the effort and the resources deployed, the search of the scrubland ultimately yielded nothing of interest to the criminal investigation. No biological remains, no clothing, and no weapon were recovered. This outcome was a significant blow to the morale of the inquiry. It reinforced the ghost-like nature of the disappearance, the disturbing reality that a physical act had occurred without leaving a physical footprint. Following the physical search, the investigation turned back to the human element. In July 2014, 4 specific suspects were questioned by police. These interviews were conducted under the assumption that these individuals might hold the key to the mystery. However, as with previous leads, no new developments emerged that could justify an arrest or a charge. By April 2017, the 4 official suspects investigated during this phase were formally ruled out of the inquiry. This elimination was a double-edged sword. While it cleared innocent individuals and removed false leads, it also brought the investigation back to square one. Senior officers maintained that they were still pursuing a significant line of inquiry, a phrase often used to maintain funding and political support when specific leads have dried up. The detectives were trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that had been scattered by 7 years of wind and rain. The failure of the scrubland search and the elimination of the 41 suspects highlighted the difficulty of building a forensic case so long after the fact. It left the public and the analysts asking a haunting question. If the answer wasn't in the scrubland, and it wasn't with these 41 individuals, then where and who was the key to the mystery? The stage was set for a dormant period, one that would only be broken by a revelation from a completely different jurisdiction years later. In June of 2020, nearly 13 years after the initial incident in Praia da Luz, the investigation experienced a seismic shift. For over a decade, the narrative had drifted between the theories of a random stranger, a burglary gone wrong, and unfounded domestic speculation. However, the announcement made by German authorities introduced a level of specificity and gravity that had been absent since the early days of the inquiry. Police revealed that a 43-year-old German national, referred to publicly as Christian B., had been identified as a new prime suspect. This development did not just add a name to the list. It fundamentally realigned the international understanding of the case. The identification of Christian B. was not a result of a sudden forensic discovery at the scene, but rather the culmination of intelligence sharing and data analysis. The suspect was described as currently serving a prison sentence in Germany for unrelated matters. From a criminological perspective, this detail is significant. It suggests that the individual was already within the radar of the justice system, fitting the profile of a career offender rather than an opportunistic first-time criminal. The authorities noted that he had lived in the Algarve region between 1995 and 2007, placing him geographically close to the resort at the critical time. The release of this information was handled with extreme caution by the investigators. In adherence to German privacy laws and to protect the integrity of the ongoing legal process, the suspect's full surname was not officially used, and he was referred to simply as Christian B. This anonymity, while frustrating to a public eager for a face to blame, is a standard procedural safeguard. It prevents the trial by media that could compromise future judicial proceedings. Journalists and analysts have noted that this level of secrecy often indicates that the prosecutors believe they are building a serious case, one that they do not want jeopardized by a technicality or a claim of prejudice. A critical divergence in the investigative narrative emerged alongside this announcement. While the British detectives continued to treat the case as a missing person inquiry, implying a lingering hope for survival, the German investigators took a much darker stance. They classified their inquiry as a loss-of-life investigation. They publicly stated their assumption that the missing daughter was no longer alive. This stark declaration was a brutal blow to the hope that had sustained the campaign for years. It transformed the objective from rescue to recovery, and from resolution to justice. The profile of Christian B., provided by the authorities, painted a disturbing picture without needing to use graphic descriptors. He was characterized as having a criminal history that included multiple convictions. The police revealed that he had a transient lifestyle during his time in Portugal, living in a camper van and a ramshackle dwelling near the resort. This lifestyle aligns with the drifter profile, often associated with individuals who can move undetected across borders and between communities. Analysts suggest that this transient nature explains why he might have slipped through the initial dragnets in 2007. He was a ghost in the system, living on the fringes of the expatriate and local communities. The reaction from the family was one of cautious validation. In a statement, the parents thanked the police, reiterating that their primary desire was to uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice. They acknowledged the painful reality of the German prosecutor's assumption, stating that while they would never give up hope of finding their daughter alive, they needed to know the outcome to find peace. This statement highlights the excruciating position of the family, caught between the not knowing that fuels hope and the knowing that might bring despair. Following the appeal for information regarding Christian B., the Metropolitan Police in the United Kingdom received more than 270 calls and emails. This response volume indicated that the German connection had unlocked memories and tips that had lain dormant for years. Witnesses who might have seen a camper van or a man fitting the description, but thought nothing of it at the time, were now coming forward. From a journalistic viewpoint, the emergence of Christian B. represents the triumph of cold case methodology. It proved that the answer to the mystery was likely hidden in the files all along, waiting for the right connection to be made between a name, a location, and a timeline. The investigation had moved from searching the physical ground of the scrubland to searching the history of those who walked it. The focus was now squarely on dismantling the alibi and the movements of one man, turning the inquiry into a forensic audit of a life lived in the shadows of the Algarve. By the year 2021, the focus of the investigation had narrowed significantly around the German national, Christian B. However, for a case built on circumstantial evidence, the challenge for prosecutors was to place the suspect not just in the general region, but at the specific location during the critical window of the incident. The primary link between Christian B. and the Ocean Club Resort is a mobile phone record. Investigators identified that a cell phone attributed to the suspect pinged a tower serving the area of Praia da Luz on the evening of May 3, 2007. In modern criminal investigations, cell site analysis is a powerful tool, yet it is not precise. It places a device within a sector, but it cannot pinpoint a specific room or building. Legal analysts argue that while this proves proximity, it does not prove presence at the exact scene of the taking. Further scrutiny was placed on the vehicles associated with the suspect. Attention centered on a distinctive camper van and a sedan, both of which were reportedly used by Christian B. during his residency in the Algarve. The camper van, in particular, fits the profile of a vehicle that allows for the discreet transport and concealment of a subject. Police appealed for information regarding the movements of these vehicles, hoping that holiday photos from other tourists might inadvertently contain an image of the van in the background. The legal stakes escalated dramatically in April 2022. Portuguese prosecutors formally declared Christian B. an arguido, or formal suspect. This procedural move was not necessarily an indication that an arrest was imminent, but rather a strategic legal maneuver. Under Portuguese law, there are strict time limits, statutes of limitations on the ability to prosecute certain serious crimes. With the 15th anniversary of the disappearance approaching, authorities needed to designate a suspect to stop the clock and preserve their ability to bring charges in the future. This declaration brought the German and Portuguese investigations into a formal, albeit complex, alignment. However, the suspect has maintained his silence. His legal team has argued that the evidence is purely circumstantial and that being in a town is not a crime. This defense highlights the central struggle of the entire case: the gap between suspicion and proof. Without a confession or biological evidence linking the suspect directly to the missing daughter, the investigation remains in a state of legal purgatory. In early 2023, the investigation faced an unexpected and volatile distraction. A young woman from Poland emerged on social media, claiming that she might be the missing daughter. This development serves as a case study in how modern true crime culture interacts with active investigations. The claim was not driven by police intelligence, but by the individual's own questions regarding her identity and fragmented early memories. The global reaction was immediate and polarized. Internet communities, which had spent years dissecting the case, became divided. Some viewed the claim as a cruel hoax or a sign of mental distress, while others saw it as a potential miracle. From a sociological perspective, this incident revealed the public's desperate desire for a resolution. The emotional investment in the story is so deep that even improbable leads are seized upon with intensity. The narrative of this question of identity dominated the media cycle for weeks, overshadowing the ongoing forensic work regarding Christian B. The individual pointed to physical similarities, such as a specific mark in the eye, a detail that had been a key identifier of the missing daughter since 2007. However, facial recognition experts and investigators remained skeptical, citing distinct differences in facial structure. Ultimately, the resolution came through science. A deoxyribonucleic acid test, commonly known as a DNA test, was conducted. The results conclusively proved that the young woman from Poland was not the missing individual. While this outcome restored the focus to the official investigation, it left a trail of emotional damage. It forced the family to endure yet another cycle of raised hopes and crushing disappointment. It also highlighted the vulnerability of the missing status. Without a definitive conclusion, the void is easily filled by speculation and claimants. Following the diversion of the Polish claim, the official investigation returned to the physical evidence with renewed vigor. In May 2023, a major search operation was launched at the Arade Dam, a reservoir located approximately 30 miles from Praia da Luz. This location had been identified as a place of interest because the suspect, Christian B., reportedly referred to it as his little paradise or a sanctuary. The operation was massive in scale. Portuguese police, assisted by German officers and watched by British liaisons, sealed off a peninsula jutting into the water. Heavy machinery was brought in to clear scrubland, and divers were deployed to search the murky depths of the reservoir. The imagery of the search was stark. Officers in tactical gear raking through the soil, looking for any anomaly that did not belong in the natural landscape. This search differed from previous ones. It was intelligence-led, based specifically on the profile of the German suspect rather than general theories of a wander-off. Investigators were looking for non-perishable items, perhaps fragments of clothing or specific objects that could be linked to the incident. The search lasted for 3 days. While several bags of material were removed for forensic analysis, no immediate breakthrough was announced. Later in the year, in October, a significant diplomatic gesture occurred. The Portuguese police issued an apology to the parents of the missing daughter. They acknowledged that the initial investigation in 2007 had been mishandled. They admitted that insufficient importance was given to the procedure for missing young individuals at the time, and that the parents' position as foreigners in an unfamiliar legal environment was not fully appreciated. This apology was a watershed moment. It validated the long-standing complaints of the family regarding their treatment during the Aguido phase of 2007. It marked a formal shift in the institutional attitude of the Portuguese authorities, moving from defensiveness to a position of cooperation and regret. This change in tone is crucial for the ongoing partnership between the German, British, and Portuguese teams as they continue to build their case. As the timeline advances to 2025, the case remains active, defying the typical lifespan of a criminal inquiry. In April 2025, the government of the United Kingdom approved more than £100,000 in additional funding for Scotland Yard detectives. This financial commitment confirms that the British authorities still view the case as a solvable crime rather than a closed file. In May 2025, the family marked the 18th anniversary of the disappearance. In a public statement, they affirmed that their determination to leave no stone unturned remains unwavering. This perseverance is the emotional engine that keeps the case in the public eye. However, a new urgency has arisen regarding the prime suspect. In May 2025, reports emerged that Christian B., who is serving a sentence for a separate serious offense committed in 2005, is set to be released from prison in Germany later than originally scheduled. His release is anticipated in September 2025 or possibly early 2026 if fines are not paid. The prospect of the suspect's release has accelerated investigative efforts. On June 3, 2025, fresh searches led by German police commenced in Portugal. These searches focused on the areas between Praia da Luz and Lagos, specifically targeting locations close to the ramshackle dwelling where Christian B. lived at the time of the disappearance. The renewed activity suggests that prosecutors are racing against the clock to gather enough evidence to bring charges related to the incident before the suspect regains his freedom. After nearly 2 decades, the disappearance remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in modern history. The investigation has evolved from a local search for a lost individual into a complex, multinational operation involving 3 countries and costing millions of pounds. The financial cost is staggering. By September 2015, the British investigation alone had cost more than £10 million. With the additional funding approved in 2025, the total expenditure reflects the extraordinary nature of the case. Critics often question this allocation of resources, but supporters argue that the protection of young individuals and the pursuit of justice for a taken citizen justifies the expense. The theories have narrowed, yet the definitive answer remains elusive. The stranger theory, once vague, has solidified around a specific individual with a history of predatory behavior. The burglary gone wrong, and domestic theories have largely receded in the face of the evidence pointing toward the German suspect. However, without a physical recovery of the missing daughter, the case lacks the finality that the legal system and the family requires. The incident at the Ocean Club has changed the way the world views travel, safety, and the security of secure locations. It has highlighted the vulnerabilities of cross-border policing and the power of media in shaping legal narratives. As the fresh searches in 2025 continue, the world watches with a familiar sense of held breath. The investigation is no longer just about finding a missing person. It is about testing the limits of justice and the ability of truth to survive the erosion of time. Until a verdict is reached or a discovery is made, the story remains an open wound, a tragedy without an ending.